this edition of the Newsmakers, a special report from the Syrian city of Jarablus after it was liberated from Daesh. We ask if Turkey's ground offensive in Syria is a game changer in the war. Also on today's program, was it a hello from space? Most likely not, but we'll be finding out why astronomers are still talking about alien civilizations getting in touch. And in Picture This, a show of force by Venezuela's opposition as 1 million people take to the streets calling for President Maduro to go. Hello and welcome to the Newsmakers with me, Imran Garda. It's a small Syrian town that had been under the control of Daesh for 18 months. But last week, Jarablus was liberated by the Turkish military together with opposition forces from the Free Syrian Army. The town is less than 3 kilometers away from the Turkish-Syrian border, and it took only a few hours to take control of it. But freeing Jarablus from Daesh is not the only aim of Turkey's ground operation into its war-torn neighbor. Turkish troops, alongside Syrian rebels, are also fighting to push back Kurdish forces that Turkey considers an unacceptable threat to its national security. Today's newsmaker is the Syrian city of Jarablus. As life is gradually going back to normal there, we discuss the impact of Turkey's intervention on the intractable Syrian war.
A Syrian town just liberated from Daesh. There are no stores, no food carts, only the hues of war. Most of the 30,000 people who lived here before the war have left and have now been replaced with the scars of what a terror group left behind. Aid convoys deliver thousands of meals. The main streets are busy again. The Free Syrian Army patrols them. Yet the atmosphere is tense. The signs of Daesh's presence are still everywhere. And some fear Daesh infiltrators may still be here, among the crowd. It wasn't just in public. They also terrorized the people behind these walls. This was a Daesh prison. This man shows us how prisoners were bound and tortured, and where they were beheaded. More than a dozen people were found crammed into small spaces like these. Others were locked in isolation. Former Daesh prison guards are now prisoners behind their own bars. Daesh fighters had to leave in a hurry when Turkish and Syrian opposition forces entered the town, leaving behind documents, photographs, and pills. Hundreds of them. The spillover from Syria's war took Turkey to a tipping point after a suspected Daesh suicide bomber struck a Kurdish wedding in Gaziantep. An attack that killed 54 people, most of them children. Turkey launched Operation Euphrates Shield to push out Daesh from its borders. After freeing Jarablus, the Turkish military and Syrian opposition forces are now advancing towards Manbij, a town held by the US-backed YPG. The US has asked them to move to the east of the Euphrates River, but the PKK-linked YPG militants still continue to launch attacks on Turkish troops. Back in liberated Jarablus, just days after the Turkish military helped Syrian rebels drive out Daesh, these hand gestures may be signaling triumph or a plea for peace, which has been absent for most of their lives. Rahul Radhakrishnan, The Newsmakers.
From Paris, I'm joined by Basma Kodmani, a member of the negotiation team for the Syrian opposition in Geneva and director of the Arab Reform Initiative think tank. Thanks so much for joining us, Basma. So, Turkey might be in it for the long haul in northern Syria because it still hasn't achieved all of its objectives. Are you comfortable with that?
We have been through a very alarming situation over the last few weeks and months, really, because as much as the Free Syrian Army is keen and eager to fight ISIS, we have looked with much concern at the consequences of using particularly the Kurdish PYD forces as the striking force against ISIS. And we did suspect that this would result in new problems in a situation where the PYD, which has unfortunately never expressed a position that is reconcilable with what the Syrians in general and the broad opposition would like to see happen in Syria for a democratic transition. The PYD has never joined that agenda, and now seeing on the ground with its own agenda, seeing it gain ground, control territory, actually expel some inhabitants in some of the areas it is conquering. So we were alarmed. Seeing Turkey step in this context has, from our perspective, two potentially positive aspects. The first is indeed to signal to the PYD that its agenda is not going to work if it is not going to be attentive and respectful of what the Syrian opposition broadly wants. And perhaps secondly, and very importantly, that the Turkish intervention may result in a de facto protection zone, protected zone, safe zone for the civilians, which we have longed for over the last 5 years and have never seen as protection of civilians.
Basma, General Joseph Votel from US CENTCOM has been praising the usefulness and value of both sides. For example, Turkey and the FSA, and on the other side, the PYD or YPG or SDF, whatever you want to call them, those Kurdish forces. What do you make of the US role here where both allies are up against each other?
I believe we and probably the Turkish government have looked with much regret at what US policy has been. It is the lack of strategic decision-making and planning on the Syrian crisis and serious management of the Syrian crisis that I think is now putting the US in a very difficult situation. Not difficult militarily, but certainly very embarrassing situation. It is revealing some form of inconsistency in American policy. Over the last 5.5 years, I think the Syrian opposition on one hand, Turkey and other countries in the region have been sounding the alarm bell about the dangers, the risks of not managing the Syrian crisis seriously. And unfortunately, that has been a very reserved American attitude towards Syria, and many moves that have never been followed up by a serious strategy. And I think it is today resulting indeed in seeing that some of the US allies are confronting each other on the ground simply because the US does not seem to have calculated fully the consequences of its choice of using the PYD, a group that is problematic for us on the ground, that is clearly problematic for Turkey as well, but for us Syrians, more than anybody else, before anybody else, are problematic. The US has chosen to ignore our warnings, to ignore our concerns, and finds itself today in this situation.
We saw some extraordinary images in the report that just preceded this discussion of Jarablus and the liberation of Jarablus. Do you expect, as many others do, a massive showdown in Manbij as we see the FSA and the Turkish forces moving in one direction and the PYD or YPG forces trying to hold on to what they have? Is there going to be a massive showdown, and might it be very bloody?
I don't believe so. I think where the Free Syrian Army is playing a role is militarily on the ground. But politically and diplomatically, the Turkish presence and the Turkish intervention is, I believe, prepared politically with the two key players, Russia on one side and the US on the other. I think Turkey has made its case. It has been making its case for many years now. It has made the case for this intervention. And so I believe that the PYD, if it is not receiving active support as it has so far from the United States or from Russia, particularly at the moment from the United States, there is hope that we can avoid such a battle. The PYD might realize that it does not have the backing it needs in order to confront a powerful alliance with Turkish forces on the ground and the coalition of Free Syrian Army fighters.
What about the argument that Operation Euphrates Shield will weaken Daesh? Great. Will weaken the PYD? Great. But it doesn't touch the regime, and the regime sits there as a spectator. Is there credence to that argument?
Well, I happen to believe, being within the opposition, I happen to believe that we have some work to do on the ground in order to have a security situation in the north of Syria in particular that proves that there is an alternative to the regime. And if that alternative is organized by stabilizing territory, by agreeing on what local governance can be set up in those areas, and we know exactly who should be in control. It's the populations of these regions. The Free Syrian Army should be that security force, this stabilization force. So there needs to be a security plan that proves that there is an alternative here that is emerging. And that is when I think we will have a persuasive argument about the regime can be removed through negotiations. That has been our position, in a controlled way, and that we will not have chaos in those areas as the regime has been claiming would happen.
From the perspective of the Syrian opposition, the Russians are involved. They have better relations with Turkey now. They have a semblance of communications with the United States. Which would you prefer, for the Russians to be isolated and ostracized, or for the Russians to be at the table because they are the only gateway to talking to the regime and perhaps negotiations?
The latter is definitely what we would prefer. We would prefer to see an active, constructive Russia at the table. For now, unfortunately, we have seen cynicism, we have seen complicity in war crimes committed by the regime and by Russian Air Force. But what we would like to see is Russia delivering and helping reach a negotiated settlement and a safe transition, meaning a controlled process of Assad out of the picture in Syria, and a transition that happens without him in order for it to be successful. So Russia has the potential to play this role. At the moment, we are not seeing any sign, unfortunately, that it is willing to play this role. So we do hope that what will come out from the discussions with Turkey is something where Russia realizes there are vital interests for Turkey in this country, Syria. There is a need for stabilization. There is no future to the Assad government. Can we have both Turkey push Russia into that role of a slightly more honest broker, because we have not seen that so far.
Turkey wants to achieve a buffer zone in the north of Syria. Do you want them to go a step further and create a corridor to Aleppo?
Look, I think it is difficult to say we would like to see a foreign power extend its presence on the ground. This is considered by many Syrians as intervention without authorization. From the opposition side, we don't look at the Syrian government as being the one who should authorize. It has no legitimacy. The opposition has seen that it is in its interest to see Turkey help in ousting ISIS and ousting the PYD from areas in the north of Syria. Beyond that, I think this is something that needs to be negotiated and agreed with the political leadership of the Syrian opposition. These consultations are taking place, and those moves may happen because the Syrian opposition may decide that this is in its interest. The pattern of Free Syrian Army elements supported by artillery, heavy weaponry, and air force from Turkey is a pattern that is potentially successful in ousting ISIS and stabilizing territory in Syria. We've been longing for this kind of model. We wanted the international coalition to play this role, the US to play this role. It hasn't happened. I think seeing Turkey play this role today can potentially deliver something positive. But that obviously needs to be negotiated with the opposition, and that I think is what is happening as Turkey moves along.
Basma Kodmani, good to talk to you. Thank you very much. Coming up on the Newsmakers, Russian scientists dismiss claims that an unusual radio signal could have been from an alien civilization. We'll be asking how they can be so sure. And in Picture This, a desperate economic crisis is making life intolerable for many Venezuelans. And they've taken to the streets in huge numbers to call for President Maduro to go. Was it a message from an alien civilization or something far more prosaic? Russian scientists say an unusual radio signal they detected last year most likely has an earthly explanation, but it's still got many people in the world of astronomy interested. We'll be talking to one of them in a moment, but first, Yvette McCullough explains what all the excitement was about.
It was thought we could be getting an extraterrestrial message, but Russian scientists now say the mysterious radio signal they detected did not come from far, far away. The strong signal spikes were thought to have possibly come from the constellation Hercules, from a 6.3 billion-year-old star that's 95 light-years away. So if this had been a communication source in outer space, what would that have meant? If it had been beamed directly at our solar system, this could suggest it was sent by an intelligent Kardashev Type 1 civilization, one that is able to harness energy from its host star, like we do with solar panels. But if it was sent out into the galaxy at random, it would have needed a huge amount of energy for us to detect it, suggesting a civilization so technologically advanced they can harness the entire energy of their host star. Russian scientists have now put an end to the speculation, but it does raise the intriguing question: if there is life up there trying to make contact, what would it look like or sound like?
Joining me now from Los Angeles is Seth Shostak. He's a senior astronomer at the SETI Institute, which stands for the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence. Thanks for joining us. Seth, are you disappointed?
Well, of course we are. It would be much more interesting if this signal were actually coming from this star system and represented the efforts of a civilization. But, you know, we've had a lot of false alarms. You're going to have false alarms. This is exploration, and sometimes you're going to be fooled by the evidence. One day, we hope we won't be being fooled.
So are you absolutely certain that this was a false alarm and that, or is there perhaps a sort of 1 in a billion chance, maybe?
I can't say for sure that this is a false alarm, but what I can say is that we've looked at in the direction of this star system. The star is called HD 164595, not a very easy name to pronounce, but we've looked at it for several nights using our Allen telescope array here in Northern California, and we don't find the signal. Some astronomers at the University of California at Berkeley have also looked for this. They don't see it either. So given all that, I think you have to conclude, if it's ET on the line, they've gone on vacation and they're not broadcasting anymore. So it certainly wouldn't be science to say that we found a signal coming from another society. I think it's enormously more likely that what we found is a satellite passing over the Russian radio telescope.
How easy is it to confuse the terrestrial for the extraterrestrial when you're looking for signals?
Well, actually, it's very easy, because what are we looking for? We're looking for a signal that's at one spot on the radio dial, just like this television broadcast, just like any radio broadcast. They're at one spot on the dial. That's why you tune them in. Now, if you find a signal like that coming from the sky, you say, that's not natural. That's not a quasar or a pulsar or hot gas, cold gas, all of these things that make natural radio emission. This is something made by a transmitter. We don't necessarily know what they're saying. We probably wouldn't know what they're saying, but we would at least know that they built a transmitter, so they're technologically competent. So that's how you would tell.
Mm-hmm. Some of us have read Carl Sagan's Contact, watched the movie with Jodie Foster. This is fascinating, right? The implications were what exactly? If this was the real deal, this would have been a supremely advanced civilization, wouldn't it? Just tell us a little bit about that and what it would have meant if this was for real.
Well, to begin with, to address the question of, is it a supremely advanced civilization? Obviously, I don't know much about their poetry or anything like that, so I don't know how advanced they are in those regards. But in terms of their technology, yes, because the energy required, the power requirements for their transmitter in order to make a signal that from 95 light years away we could pick up so easily are considerable. I mean, it's at least billions and billions of watts, as Carl Sagan would like to say. And that's something that we can't do right now. Okay, but maybe they can. I think the real significance is not that, though. The real significance would be, if we were to find a signal, we would know not only that there's life in space, but that some of that life, at least in one instance, had developed intelligence and, an understanding of the laws of nature. That would prove that what has happened here on Earth, while very interesting for sure, especially to us, is not a miracle. It's not something terribly special. It's something that has happened all over the place. It's like being an ant in my backyard. Yeah, you're a special ant to you, but there are lots of other ants.
Are you worried that with this false alarm, there might be a lack of interest, maybe even a lack of funding when it comes to the search for extraterrestrial life? Or maybe perhaps the next time something might be real, people wouldn't take it seriously?
Well, let me point out that the funding for our SETI searches is all privately donated anyhow. It's just, people who send us some money. There's no government money for this, not in the United States. So, will that be effective? Will people think, oh, well, there was a false alarm? Well, of course, the false alarm came out of Russia to begin with, and they don't have much to do with that. But I do think that it will actually increase the interest, because people will see, this is possible. No, it wasn't the case this time, but maybe next time or the time after that. We now know about planets out there that we didn't know about 10 years ago. We know that there are like a million planets just in our galaxy. I think that the public appreciates the fact that with all that real estate, with all that territory, it seems pretty likely that we're not the only people around.
So you're saying I'm not special?
Well, I'm sure you're special in many ways, and we have people who think they're special. Many of my relatives think they're special. Well, they are in some sense. They're unique anyhow, but to say that this is the only, we're the only kids in town is probably wrong.
Seth Shostak, it's been great to talk to you. Thank you very much for taking the time. In today's Picture This, we're going to Venezuela. The country is in a state of crisis, facing severe shortages of food, medicine, and other basic goods. The opposition blames President Maduro for the situation and are pushing for a referendum to recall him. On Thursday, they took to the streets in huge numbers to make their voices heard. Let's take a look.
muriéndose de hambre, personas que no tienen medicina y se están muriendo por falta de medicina. O sea, hay que hacer algo porque de verdad estamos muy mal.
Today's newsmaker was the Syrian town of Jarablus, just 3 kilometers from the Turkish border. Our reporters were the first journalists inside the town after Turkish forces, along with rebels from the Free Syrian Army, drove out Daesh. They found a population hungry and traumatized after 18 months under Daesh control. But as life gets back to some degree of normality for people in Jarablus, we asked what the broader impact is of Turkey's intervention in Syria. Basma Kodmani, who's a member of the opposition negotiating team in Geneva, told us they welcome Turkey's action because the YPG forces that Ankara is also pushing back represent a threat for Syria that is deeply problematic for the opposition. You've been watching this edition of the Newsmakers with me, Imran Garda. Thank you for watching. Bye-bye.